Imagine a city that keeps secrets like a person keeps scars, folded under clothing, hidden behind polite smiles, talked about only in whispers. Now imagine standing at its very center and feeling, for one brief moment, both the present and the past at once. The hum of traffic becomes the rattle of carts. The glass towers blur into brick and soot. The voices you hear turn into a chorus from another age. If you listen closely, you can hear those old voices. They are patient. They wait. This is the story of one of those voices, a whisper that hid for more than a century inside a small silver locket. It is the story of Clara Vance, who ran a tiny antique shop and believed every object had a memory. It is the story of Julian Thorne, an heir who inherited steel and iron and an identity built on a tidy family story. And it is the story of two people from the past, Jacob and Eleanor, whose love and loss were almost erased by power and fear. What begins with a found locket becomes a reckoning that has the power to rewrite a family's history and, for a while at least, set the forgotten free. Close your eyes for a second and picture the shop. Not just any shop, but a narrow, crooked place that smelled of lemon oil and old paper, tucked between two taller, more ordinary buildings. The sign creaked on its hinge and read Vance's Curiosities in hand-painted gold. Inside, sunlight came through glass that had seen 100 winters, pooling with warm, thin fingers on worn wooden floors. Dust floated in the beams like tiny, patient islands. Clara moved through that shop with the quiet authority of someone who belonged within its small universe. She catalogued and handled, mended and polished, and listened. She listened to customers and to objects. She could tell you which clock was happiest at noon and which porcelain dog had been loved so hard that the glaze had thinned. She kept receipts in a small, crooked drawer and tucked letters inside the spines of books she meant to read, but never did. She inherited the shop from her mother, and before that it belonged to someone who insisted on buying tea from a particular kettle. And before that, it was a room where sailors traded maps. Every object stacked a story on top of another. On a humid autumn afternoon, Clara accepted a crate from an estate sale on the edge of town. An old manor finally emptied. Its rooms cleared, its secrets boxed and labeled by professionals who did not have patience for nuance. The box was unremarkable, cardboard gone soft at the corners and a label that said simply, miscellaneous. Most of its contents were as the label promised. But near the bottom, with the weight of time pressing around it, lay a tarnished silver locket wrapped in a newspaper dated 1912. She had the practiced curiosity of the kind of person who could tell a story from a fingerprint of dust. She set the box on the counter, slid a lamp closer, and eased the locket out. The metal was cold and heavier than it looked. The cover bore swirling Art Nouveau veins and one single letter, an elegant T at its center. Clara ran a thumb along the engraving, and the motion felt like waking a sleeping thing. She tried to pry the locket open and found it stuck, fused by old grime and years. She went for her small jeweler's pliers, fingers steady, breath even. A small twist, a faint pop. The clasp surrendered. The lid rose, and inside she found not a photograph, but a hand-painted miniature, a woman with hair like a small bonfire and eyes so green they felt like memory itself. Behind that portrait was a tiny rolled note. Clara unrolled it. The ink was faded, but the message read, "My dearest Eleanor, my compass is true north, and it points only to you. Wait for me at the old mill at midnight. Forever yours, Jacob." Imagine holding a sentence that someone wrote 100 years ago. Imagine the ache in those 5 words and the longing packed like a seed inside the curve of the letters. The locket was a compass that had waited for someone to listen. It was then, in the warm clutter of the shop, that the bell over the door rang again. The sound was not the casual chime of a window-shopping visitor. It had a defined edge, like someone used to authority opening the door. The man who entered had a presence people usually notice without wanting to. He was tall, the shoulders of his suit cut in a way that called attention back to them, and his gait was precise. Julian Thorne. The name belonged to the city in the way monuments do. He moved through public life with a calm, both practiced and transactional. He told people what had to be told, and he made sure the things he wanted happened. When he saw the locket, the calm in his face tightened. He asked simply, "Where did you find that?" Clara, feeling protective, said, "It was part of an estate lot I bought." "It's not for sale." Julian's next move was quiet but exact. He reached into his jacket and produced another chain, another locket, identical down to the faintest flourish. He opened his with a practiced flick. Inside, a miniature portrait of a young man. Dark eyes, steady jaw, a face that might have been a quotation of Julian's own if the years were instruments. "They belong together," he said quietly. "My family, the Thornes, had a pair like those. One for my great-grandfather, one for his fiancée, Eleanor Shaw. Hers vanished the night she vanished. We were told she ran away, but these were lost then. If you found it, I need to know how. There is a certain way power asks. It is a voice that assumes the world is its ledger, and every lost thing a lesser footnote." Clara felt the old reflex to explain, but she also felt the locket's tiny paper like a heart in her palm. She read the note again in a voice that did not sound like an accusation, but like revelation. "It's signed Jacob," she said, "not Josiah. He wrote, 'Wait for me at the old mill.'" The name hovered between them. Julian's jaw moved. For the first time that afternoon, the armor softened. There is no single moment when a life changes, not really. Change comes as a tide of small rearrangements, an unlatched chest, a line of overheard dialogue in a ledger, the slow unspooling of a carefully told lie. For both Clara and Julian, that morning was a pebble dropped into their water. The ripples would reach far. They began to work with a kind of focused, methodical energy that felt new to both. Clara pulled newspapers from 1912 at the local historical society. She sat for hours with brittle pages that smelled like dry leaves, scanning society pages, legal notices, shipping manifests. She read an item about a wedding announcement, the Thorne-Shaw union, the perfect social match. She kept turning pages, mention of a memorial, a small headline in a corner. "Tragedy strikes Shaw family. Businessman Alistair Shaw lost at sea en route to New York. Daughter Eleanor reportedly overwhelmed with grief." The dates lined up like a map with red ink. A week before her wedding, a father is lost at sea. The granddaughter is described as overcome. The wedding, however, is still scheduled. Then Clara found a photograph tucked inside an engineering ledger, a group portrait of the ironworks crew dated 1910. The caption named "Everyone." There, next to Josiah Thorne, stood a man with warm eyes and a composed smile, Jacob Walsh. Lead foreman, designer, the one they called J. Walsh. Clara read the note aloud again, the short, fierce promise. And the idea in her head hardened into a suspicion. What if the J wasn't Josiah? Who was a Thorne? But Jacob, who might not have been supposed to be there at all. Julian, back at the glass and chrome of the family offices, opened an old leather journal from his grandfather's private papers. The handwriting was furious in places, dotted with ink like thrown pebbles. One passage read, with a mood that felt like sharpened metal, "J.W. has betrayed everything. He seeks to steal what is rightfully mine, my work, my future, and my promised life. He poisons minds. He must be dealt with. The company will not suffer a traitor. There is a particular tone in words written by fear or greed. They puff up like clay and then harden into something brittle." As Julian read, the brittle thing started to look more like a hammer wound than a complaint. They could have let the matter rest between them, two people who discovered an antique coincidence. Instead, curiosity, when given the right shape, becomes courage. They chose to follow the thread. Clara returned to the shop with files, photocopies, and a new, resolute energy. She read aloud from the archive to herself and then to Julian when he came. Their voices fit differently with the material, his clipped with the economy of one who had always counted reputation in terms of assets, hers softer. Tethered to the human image in each photograph, they found small cruelty knitted into the ordinary fabric of 1912, a business alliance between the Thornes and the Shaw shipbuilders, a dinner where alliances were public and very valuable. A month of odd fires and rumors. The disappearance of a man at sea whose ship had broken its manifest pattern. A hurried funeral, and then, within weeks, a wedding announced and applauded. The mechanics of grief had been bent into a schedule. As the pieces mounted, the picture became harder to square with the story Julian had been told as a child, that of dignified loss and stoic continuity. Instead, there was the scent of something planned. Greed is a long instrument. Sometimes it plays a slow and careful note for decades. In the time they worked together, Clara found small, human things. A maid's note folded in the margin of an account book. An inventory slip with a hurried scribble. A gardener's list that mentioned a late-night meeting near the old mill on a page otherwise devoted to planting radishes. These weren't proof, but they were a rhythm, a pattern of footsteps that led somewhere. Clara went further. She began speaking to the town's oldest residents, those who loved history in the way some people love family recipes. Mr. Alden at the corner bakery remembered his grandmother telling him about the Thorne wedding, and not with pride. He spoke of hushed tones when he mentioned the name Walsh. An elderly woman who used to be a maid in a wealthy household insisted she had heard. As a child, a story about a young foreman who had fallen deeply in love with a boss's fiancée. Stories like cloth fray at the edges, and every telling added a wrinkle. But wrinkles sometimes hide the face beneath. Meanwhile, Julian was experiencing a different kind of unraveling. He found ledger entries in his family's archives that abbreviated names and smoothed edges. He read minutes from a board meeting, where phrases like restructuring and consolidation of designs appeared without the human cost. In a private envelope, a small oil stain hid a page that read, "Remove J. Walsh from payroll. Illness to be recorded. His designs shall be contracted under Thorne patent." No mention, no inquiry. He read it again and again until the letters lost their breath and looked like the tracks of a machine. What do you do when the story you were raised on begins to look like an architecture of omission? You sit with the discomfort. You weigh your relationship to truth against the weight of what maintaining a lie buys you. The pressure came in quiet ways. The Thorne board suggested discretion. One senior family friend, a man who had been a board member for decades, visited with a sympathetic expression and a precise warning. There are things families keep private for the greater good. You must understand that some disclosures fracture more than they heal. Julian listened, fingers on the rim of his coffee, feeling the chill of being asked to choose between an origin story and a confession. But history does not surrender itself to convenience, and truth, once coaxed into visibility, often insists. Clara found a box in her attic that once belonged to her grandmother. Inside it was a small leather-bound diary with a scuffed edge and the name Maeve O'Malley written on the inside cover. Maeve had been a lady's maid to Eleanor Shaw. Clara read the pages carefully, letting the handwriting inside her mouth. The entry dated the week of the wedding was short and quick and terrified. The house is in mourning, but it is a strange, cold morning. Mr. Shaw is gone. Miss Eleanor walks like a shadow, and she cries for Jacob. She begged me to keep her silver locket safe. She swore she and Jacob had a plan. She said they would meet at the old mill at midnight, if God willed it. I have hidden the locket under my things. I fear for them and for what might follow. Mr. Thorne's men are everywhere. If anything happens to Jacob, I will always know where the locket is kept. Read those sentences slowly. The fear in the strokes of Maeve's ink is visible across time. She hid the locket. She hid a token of love. She hoped, as people often hope, to keep a tiny flame alive long after the world was made of darker things, and then the pattern became more damning. Another page, another margin note. A housemaid writing how two men discussed settlements in a pantry. A laborer's ledger showing a sudden and unexplained absence. The traces were small, but they built the kind of case that refuses to be a coincidence. At one point, Clara and Julian decided to visit the old mill itself. The mill sat on the edge of town then as now, though it had been rebuilt and repurposed several times. They walked across the grass at dusk. The mill, now a hulking silhouette softened by ivy and time, had a balcony that faced the river and a stone stair that led down to the water. Everything smelled faintly of iron and wet leaves. Standing there, Clara read the little note again aloud. They set it down on the worn stone as if to let the place drink it back. The mill seemed to listen. As the investigation gained momentum, the human side of the story opened. They started to read aloud letters, actual letters, between Jacob and Eleanor. Clara spent a slow afternoon tracing the looped pen strokes of the past. Julian watched, not with the distance of a man owning an asset, but like someone reclaiming a human story he didn't know he needed. One such letter, worn at the creases, read, "Eleanor, the mills run until dusk, and each wheel sings your name. Tonight I will wait by the east door. If the dogs are quiet, I will come through the lane with a lantern. Bring the locket, bring the promise. I will bring the map that shows our passage over the river. If we cannot cross together, leave the locket with Maeve. I swear by every bolt I have turned that this will not be the last of us. Forever, Jay." Read in the quiet, these sentences feel like a vow rather than a plan. You can almost feel the cautious excitement of a run-out and the jitter of fear in the margins. Jacob planned with the precision of a man who worked with materials and tolerances. But his plans were made soft by love. Another letter from Eleanor, short, urgent, read, "Jacob, the house is full of men with polite smiles. They have asked me questions like the weather. Maeve says, be brave, but my hands fail me. If anything happens, remember the clock in the east parlor. The face hides more than the hour. I promise to find you. Breakhamta ERA." You can sense the tiny conspiracies suggested. A clock with a hidden compartment, a maid who becomes a guardian of memory, a plan that depends on times and tricks. The letters were not dramatic conspiratorial manifestos. They were human and small, and therefore more dangerous to a family that preferred clean lines. As the evidence multiplied, Julian had to face something heavy. In the archives, he found a ledger sentence where a design patent credited to Jacob Walsh was transferred to the Thorne patent with a line written, "Acquired through direct contractual consolidation." In a private folder, he found an account marked compensation with a sum that did not match any formal employment agreement. Jacob's signature appeared on the letterhead, or rather, a smudge where a signature should have been. It is one thing to read a list of transaction numbers and quite another to imagine how a human being disappears under them. Julian could see names on pages. He could also now see the human faces behind those numbers. He felt the cognitive chill of realizing that powerful families write the first drafts of history and sometimes leave the bloodstains out of the margins. What do you do next? Julian had options. He could close the files, call a lawyer, and arrange for quiet settlements designed to keep a name intact. Or he could use the things he'd been taught to use power for, to make a public thing of the truth and accept the consequences the truth brought. He chose truth. When Julian brought the evidence to the board, the room smelled faintly of old wood polish and colder things, reputation, consequence, legal counsel. Board members had built their conversations around the stability of the company, the weight of contracts, the comfort of legacy. They looked at the evidence with practical eyes and offered practical counsel. Bury it, quietly. For the good of the company, for the comfort of shareholders, for the maintenance of an image valuable to markets and municipal councils alike. One elder, a man with years of experience pressing people into useful arrangements, said, "Some stories, Julian, do not need the light. They shatter institutions that people rely on for their daily bread." Julian thought of his own history, of how the Thorne name had built neighborhoods, employed thousands, and been a source of civic identity. But he also thought of Maeve's handwriting, of the little folded note, of Jacob's precise engineering sketches, with margins thick with love. He thought of a man whose inventions had shaped the city, but who had been denied a name for that work. When he stood up in that polished boardroom and said no, the single word felt like a hinge swinging. "No, I will not bury it. the decision did not stop the backlash. There were lawyers and subpoenas and a storm of PR and a murmur of social media that made the air feel thin. There were also quiet moments that reminded both of them why the work mattered. Clara received a letter from a distant cousin of Maeve, who had a photograph of Jacob and Eleanor on a bench at the river and had never known why the couple were not named anywhere in family histories. An elderly engineer in a nearby town sent Julian a letter that praised the technical ingenuity he thought had always been credited to the Thorne patent and, quietly, hinted that the real author had been marginalized. Julian arranged for Jacob Walsh to be credited publicly for the patents and designs his family had long claimed. That is a particular kind of reckoning, taking apart a myth in public and reconstructing a narrative that includes the nameless. It is work that tastes of metal filings and stubborn grief. Together they founded a small public memorial and a scholarship for young engineers in Jacob's name. Julian insisted the scholarship not be named after his own family, but after Jacob and Eleanor Walsh, because truth, finally given a voice, should also honor the ones it concerns. There is a moment at the center of this story that feels quieter than others. It happens the day they place the plaque at the old mill. The sky is lenient with them. Sunlight rolls over stone and water. A small crowd gathers, neighbors, historians, young engineering students, a few members of the media. Clara stands with the locket on a small velvet cloth. Julian holds his with hands that tremble ever so slightly. They tell the story in a way that does not gloat, a recounting of small facts strung into a moral rope. The plaque reads, "In memory of Jacob Walsh and Eleanor Shaw. Two lives joined by love and broken by power, whose truth has been restored for future generations." People clap with quiet hands. The city listens. But this story is not meant to be only a sweet coda or a tidy moral. The reassignment of credit does not repair decades of erasure. It does not bring back the lives that slipped away. What it does, at best, is insist on a different kind of memory, one where the archive includes the names of those who made things happen, where a locket is more than an ornament, where a maid's handwriting is a testament rather than a voiceless annotation. Still, the small repairs matter. They change the scale of what a family can do. They reconfigure local histories and reframe a city's sense of itself. The scholarship builds a future. The plaque becomes a place where people leave small tokens, a flower, a note card, sometimes another locket that someone else found in an attic. Think for a moment about the ordinary mechanisms of erasure: a closed door, a quick accounting adjustment, a misplaced folder, a hurried notation in a ledger. Erasure often requires only a few people willing to pretend nothing unusual happened. It requires complicity in silence. But truth has a way of creeping back through the cracks of ordinary life. It moves in the hands of maids and bakers, in the speech of elderly men who will finally speak, and in the hand of a woman who believes objects keep memories and will not be paid off by convenience. There is also another, quieter consequence. Julian did not walk away from his family. He worked from within, insisting that the company support the memorial and the scholarships. The board, shamed and stirred, accepted a narrow kind of reform. They named a small gallery at the Thorne Museum after Maeve O'Malley to honor the servant who protected a secret for the sake of a promise. Ultimately, the truth cost money, reputation, and in some cases, relationships. But it bought something else, a restored history. Clara's shop, once threatened by foreclosure, found new life. People came not simply to buy antiques, but to tell her the stories of the objects they had lived with. Documentary filmmakers visited briefly and then moved on. Students arrived for the scholarship reception and then brought their own families to the mill. The whole community seemed slightly more honest, as if the city, now that it had been made to remember, preferred to do so a little more accurately. Yet even as the plaque stood and the scholarships were advertised, Clara would sometimes take the locket from its small velvet pouch and hold it in the dusk. She would read Jacob's short note slowly, feeling the small human pride that comes from having kept a secret safe enough to reveal when it mattered most. Some nights she would place it on the counter and watch the dust float in the light of passing cars, thinking of the strange ways time makes room for memory. There are small epilogues, In a classroom at the City Engineering College, a young woman accepted her scholarship and spoke about mentorship in innovation and the need to properly credit those who teach and create. She held up a small sketch and thanked Jacob. Walsh, there was a minor historical conference where a paper on early industrial design credit practices quoted the Thorne archives and Maeve's diary and the old clerk's ledger in the same breath, as if placing them side by side finally made sense. And there is the old mill, which has, over time, become a quiet public park where kids run and the river moves old leaves in tidy spirals. Couples take photos by a plaque that, for all its smallness, insists on a different truth. When you tell this story to someone else, read it aloud, or play the voiceover that has retraced this path, know that truth in many cases arrives not as a smashing reveal, but as a patient accumulation of detail, a diary written in a small hand, a ledger note tucked under an invoice, a photograph tucked in a ledger, a letter sealed and opened after a century. Each finds its way to the light because someone believes the named person matters. Jacob and Eleanor could not change the arc of their lives in the past. They could not bend back time. What we can do is make sure that in the present their names are not merely footnotes. We can insist that our histories include the complicated, inconvenient details. There are questions that remain. Why was Alistair's death allowed to remain unexplained? Who stood to gain the most by orchestrating a narrative of grief that turned into a convenient union? The record shows motives, and the record shows people who profited. But it also shows a city that, for generations, preferred a tidy story. That preference is a kind of force all its own. To break it requires courage, curiosity, and sometimes a locket in a dusty box. If, listening to this now, you find yourself tracing your own attic with your fingers, thinking about the pequeño stacks of old documents, about the photographs in a shoebox, about the small objects that seem to have been saved without real reason, that is the correct response. Our lives are made of small things. They are the archival material of who we are. Today, when you walk past the mill, you might see people take a moment to tilt their heads toward the plaque. Some will read out loud. Others will pause and think of the cost of silence. The city will carry both histories, and, perhaps, it will be a better place for it. This story, a true historical mystery that began with a tarnished locket, tells us many things: that objects can hold witness, that archives are both prisons and liberation, that love can be both a plan and a kind of resistance, and that power, unchecked, will hide discomfort in neat paperwork. But it also tells us that collective memory is mutable, that we can, if we choose, widen its frame to include those who were once edged out. Clara kept her shop. Julian helped transform the narrative that built his name. The scholarship continues. The plaque will stand so long as the people of that city stand in its light. The locket rests safe on a velvet cloth in a case that protects it from the elements, but not from remembrance. If you liked this story of lost heirlooms and uncovered truths, if you believe every object has a life, then share it with someone who loves mysteries and history. Go into your attic or library and look around. There are stories waiting. There are voices waiting to be heard. Thank you for listening.